Hello everyone, so I debated if I really wanted to talk about this, but it's that time where competitive Splatoon is dying has entered the discussion. And, it's kind of settled down by now, but I figure I'd give a bit of my take on it, and I want to try and talk about some of the problems, but I mostly want to redirect some of the energy here, because I think that it's very easy to get doom posty about it. Usually happens at this time. But I think that this period of the game where there's not a whole lot going on in terms of content and we're like in between Splatoon games, sort of, is a very important time for improving the scene and discussion about it. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. And I'll try not to be too rambly. So, why do people believe the competitive scene is dying? Number one, the game isn't getting any more content. You might have noticed that Nintendo hasn't really put anything in the game in a while. And yeah, that's pretty normal, and it would be dishonest to act like not getting new content is not helpful. I've said too many negatives here to know what I was saying. Obviously, no longer getting content hurts the ability to grow the scene. YouTube videos perform worse especially, which I am very aware of, trust me. It is something I do a lot. However, I don't think it affects comp as badly as people are saying usually. Like, obviously, it's less likely people are going to pick up Splatoon, and the player base counts and things like ranked are going to drop. But as of right now, there are actually more and more players entering tournaments on Sendu than there were 6 months ago. And we'll get into that whole thing a bit later, but that alone should tell you that more people are still getting into comp despite this. And so while I believe the lack of updates going forward is a challenge to work around, I do not believe this kills the competitive scene. So, what else might be killing it? Number two, top level sucks. So there have been a few complaints. There have been some people complaining about zones only hurting viewership, which I don't really have enough data to talk about for now, and so I'm not going to weigh in on that at the moment. But people have been talking about top level not doing as well because we haven't been seeing newer players winning tournaments. For a while, it's been a lot of the same groups, and there is a lack of teams. And so it is hard to create branding around an event. And the biggest example of this was probably 20XX a few months ago, which was a league. And the Ink TV league that happened in 2023 got a lot of attention, but this one didn't get as much. And a big part of that is probably that the majority of teams were pickups. And that's something I even covered at the time. There's a ramble on here somewhere about that. So, what's going on with top level? I think it is totally fair to say that where we are right now at top level isn't great. That's totally fine. And that matters because top level is where a lot of the viewership is going to be interested in. It's what the tournaments are going to come down between are these kinds of players. And so, what's happening with top level? So, there is a lot more to this than I'm saying here, but I think the simplest way to talk about it would be rewind the clocks to Splatoon 2. When players, rose up to become top players in Splatoon 2, it happened fast. There are a lot of big names and big teams that formed in the early Splatoon 2 era, and it happened relatively consistently throughout late 2017 to, a little bit after the pandemic when, the meta started to become kind of bad. There was a very consistent influx of new teams and new good players. Why doesn't Splatoon 3 have this? Well, the truth is, it does. But people aren't improving as fast in this game, and there is also a bit of a cutoff. And I want to try to do this in the best way, because this discussion is not meant to... I'm not trying to diss anyone here who's getting into top level, right? That's not my point here. What ends up happening is that nowadays it is a lot harder. The comps have to be very specific, even if there's a lot of weapon variety, and a lot of the best weapons are weapons that people tend to one-trick, or if not one-trick, dedicate a lot of time to. Stuff like the swords, especially Stamper, things like dually, most of the midline fighting weapons. I'd argue pencil at the level it's at right now requires a lot of dedication, like where top level pencils are in terms of optimizing the weapon. In terms of support role, the best support right now is V-Splash, which is easily the hardest of all of them, has the most depth to it by a lot and the most flexibility. So we're at a point where the game is individually very demanding. And what happens is that I think a lot of our newer top players haven't moved into that yet, haven't ended up playing these specific comps, haven't been playing like dive weapons. And an example of someone who has gone past this that I think I'd like to talk about is Clef. Clef had done like a lot of shooters in the past before. He played on teams like Bet. But in the past few months, he switched to basically one-tricking dually. I barely see him play anything else. He played with a pickup group with Yu, Gray, and Zeras, some top European players. They dedicated themselves to playing a dive composition. And they did really well in tournaments for a bit. Like, while they were playing, they were doing good. They were the best placing Western team in the 70Q Major. They got reverse swept by Japan, unfortunately. But, like, they did very good in that. And they were able to beat pretty much every other group we had. And part of that is the dedication to these weapons and this style of play. And that isn't as common. Instead, what pickup culture has tended to do, it seems in the Western scene, is rather than encouraging people to one-trick and get good at their individual weapons, it's encouraged a lot of generalists. Hence, what we see most often is like 52 shot slash neo splash in the earlier metas, plus custom blaster, the one with the splashdown. Very generalist, very easy comp to play in terms of skill floor, and it's very easy to play with different people and work well together easily. But this doesn't specialize into any playstyle, and it lacks a lot of the higher skill ceiling weapons that have more individual playmaking power. And so eventually there's a point where this comp becomes a weakness, and these style of weapons become a flaw. And eventually players have to realize that, and then go through the process of reinventing themselves and picking up some other kind of weapon. Again, Clef is an example I've told you of someone who's really figured out something that works for him. But like, that is a difficult process, even for people who have started it, and that's a difficult thing to even realize you need to start. So, what I'm saying is, because of these factors of a more individual-focused game, because of the necessities for the weapons and comps you need to play, and because the resources aren't out there for people to learn this earlier in their competitive journey, at least for many players who are mid and high level who have climbed, it leads to a point where our top players need more time to go from good enough to get, like, top 4 in a tournament to good enough to beat whatever, like, Kyo group or Gray group or Zenith group ends up winning the tournament. So that requires more work, more progress, more time. Here's the thing, that will get fixed with time. The game is in a very healthy spot, there's a lot of good weapons and options, etc., and people are learning about this, and I see more and more players every day improving with it, or dedicating themselves to better weapons, or trying to figure out what style they like. And we're even seeing the return of teams because of this. It's happening very slowly, but Vanguard formed just a few weeks ago as a top European team that's already doing pretty well. And so, we are starting to see things get better. But I'm telling you guys right now, in terms of top level, it's going to take more time. It's going to be longer than this for it to happen. And so that is going to take some time. But what I've mentioned beforehand, though, is important. Scene structure, right? This is how everything is integrated together for the player journey as competitive players rise through the ranks. So, first off, I think that low level is in a great spot. There are plenty of skill-capped tournaments that people are entering. If you're anywhere around low ink level, the scene is super built well for that, and low ink has continued to do very well along with similar events like it. Once you get past that, though, into mid, high, and top level, it's a bit more difficult what to do. There aren't really as many set events for it. There's some established ones, like In the Zone happens, but like, what are our major tournaments? When do they happen? Is like a big question mark until something gets announced. We don't really know for our top players. Weeklies vary a lot in terms of who's actually entering them and how stacked they are, and this brings us to another problem. Right now, there are a lot of tournaments. I think last weekend had around 44 tournaments in a single week. And that might, like, there's definitely some dispute on if this is a problem and what it means. Because obviously, if you're looking to play a tournament and there's more options available, there's more likely you'll find a tournament you can play. However, what's happening with the data to back it up is that despite the fact that earlier in this video I mentioned we have more players in comp, the average amount of players per tournament is dropping because people are spread throughout these tournaments. Which means that even though the scene is growing, it feels smaller because the events you're playing in are smaller. That's a tough feeling. And if you're a viewer, it's even worse. How are you going to know which of the 44 tournaments you want to decide to watch? Good luck with that. And so that creates a lot of problems. Now, there definitely needs to be a balance between these. More events is important because sometimes you'll have restriction events or you'll have events for a certain skill level and you need to, you know, have enough for everyone. But there is a limit where you have to balance these upsides and downsides. I'm not here to tell you a specific answer because I don't know it. But what I want people to start talking about when it comes to this debate is there is not a right and wrong way to do it. There are advantages and disadvantages to there being more tournaments than there were before. And I think what we need to figure out is at what point is it worth it and what point isn't it worth it? And if we are going to cut back on tournaments, how are we going to be doing that? What's the most effective way to reduce the tournament count without reducing the upsides these extra tournaments have provided? Obviously, tournaments aren't the only thing in terms of scene structure. There's a lot more to it than that. And so that brings us into content creation. Because obviously, a lot of the problems I talked about would be better if there was content. Imagine if you were trying to study up as a high-level player and you could frequently find videos of the best bucket players or the best pencil players and just watch back and study script. You know, again, higher-level players, we're assuming they know how to, like, review and improve. But the truth is, these resources aren't out there. If you want to find a VOD of, like, the best mint or the best stamper, it's really tricky. It's very difficult to find it. Not a whole lot of players upload their scrims. And that's just scrim footage being uploaded to YouTube, unedited. That's not talking about further things like guides or posting about thought processes during a match or going over their opinions on the game, all of which would have been very helpful, by the way. Because I think, you know, there was a post recently from Gray talking about top level a little bit. If that kind of post happened sooner, that might have been good to know, I think. I think hearing from the best players what they think about the game and what they think people should be doing can be helpful for people learning. Obviously, most helpful for players already higher up, but it could obviously still be useful for anyone trying to get into the game to learn off of top level. There's a whole lot of stuff that has to be done for that. So, is competitive Splatoon dying? No. The scene as a whole is fine. Top level's in a bit of a transitional period, but it's growing pretty much everywhere else. Splatoon Stronghold has a brand new beginners academy, most tournaments are still gaining an entrance, and we are doing pretty much fine. I think one thing to really be aware of when it comes to these discussions is it's very easy to look at the short term and get a bit doomer about it. It's very easy to see a few months of a rough patch and get discouraged. But when you look at the long-term scale of the Splatoon competitive scene, every 2 years or so, the scene is drastically better than it was before. And this goes for pretty much every single area you can think about. And I'm willing to bet it'll be the same thing here. In the short term, things can always look rough during these kind of patches, but they can get better. What to do, though? Here's what's most important. here's what I, like, if nothing else is taken from this video, here is the most important message. Now is the time to start fixing things. Make better content. Have players posting about the game. Try and get a better structure for players improving in the scene. Get better tournaments. Get better production. Like, obviously all of these things aren't that easy, but like, this is the time to work on these things, to have these discussions, to make this progress. Because once Splatoon 4 starts hitting, the people who have put in the effort now, especially when it comes to YouTube, are going to be the ones that benefit the most then. If we call the scene dead and refuse to put in the effort and wait for Splatoon 4 to come around, it will be too late and we will deal with these exact same problems. Splatoon 2 might have had a rough period throughout the last few years of its life, but the developments that were made from orgs like like Dapple Productions and IPL absolutely had an impact down the line that was felt when Splatoon 3 happened. And it's the same thing here. It is our job today to improve the scene, to improve production, to improve content, to improve everything for when that comes around. And a few of those effects will be felt now, but once we get more attention on the game again, having the infrastructure ready for the next wave of players to be integrated into the scene and have a better time will be far worth it. So that's everything I wanted to say. We have a lot of work to do. And yes, it's tough. It sucks not being fed content and having to deal with it and growing the comp scene. And a lot of people are new to this. That's fine. But that's the thing about the competitive scene. It isn't tied to Nintendo. It's about us trying to make our own experience for the game as good as possible. And at the end of the day, that will only change based off of the effort of the people in it. So let's make it better.